Oh, that was the Prime Minister. Was even third time lucky, but we did get there in the end. Joining us now from Brussels, keeping our fingers crossed, the line's working, UKIP leader Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage, we can see you. Can we hear you?
Yeah, I hope so, at least. Yeah.
Yep, you're loud and clear. That's a relief. Now, the Prime Minister seems to be getting somewhere. He's got 4 baskets of demands. 3 of them seem to be going along pretty well. They're quite important, if a little bit vague. And he's still negotiating on the 4th one. That's not a bad result so far.
A pathway to progress. You couldn't really invent it, could you? Look, there is only one demand here that needs any real action. The rest can all be promissory notes on a piece of paper. He wanted to cut migrant benefits for a period of up to 4 years. He's discovered that the Eastern Europeans just won't agree to it under any circumstances. He's got literally nowhere overnight. And so we're going to come back here on the 11th of February for a special little summit at which there'll be a deal. And the deal will be that we'll restrict migrant benefits, but at the same time, we'll restrict benefits for British citizens who've lived abroad for a period of years. That's what the deal will be. But we haven't talked about any of the big stuff. Do you remember the Bloomberg speech? This big renegotiation of Britain's relationship with Europe, fundamental treaty change, questioning whether we could control our borders, all of that is out of the window. It's now down to one basic demand, which he can't get without British people paying some of the price too.
If the Prime Minister had gone for a deal which involved free trade with the European Union, but released us from many of the political obligations, but we stayed inside the EU with free trade, would you have supported staying in?
Would I support a deal with our European neighbours where we had a free trade deal, where we had reciprocity on student exchanges, where we had a format and a forum in which we could agree common minimum standards, and where we could be good Europeans in every sense, but have the supremacy of our own law in our own parliament and our own courts and control our borders, given those things, of course.
But even if we still stayed within the European Union?
But you can't stay inside a political union who since 1957 have insisted upon the supremacy of European law and do those things. And what it goes to prove is that actually what Harold Wilson did in the referendum 40 years ago was quite deliberately lie to the British public, and I don't think we're going to be gulled again.
All right. Danny Finkelstein. There we go. Little elves hard at work there. Nigel Farage, our, as you know, entirely kosher poll there comes out for a big Remain in. A lot of young people there. That may have something to do with it. But how do you read the polls at the moment? Or even more fundamentally, do the polls even matter at the moment until the people get engaged in this issue?
I think the momentum has shifted since the May the 7th general election, and there's no question that the energy and the excitement has been on the side of those of us who want to leave behind the European Union and move on to something more positive and better. But I mean, you're right. Obviously, if we took the Lord Ashcroft poll, which showed the Leave side 8 points ahead, we might get terribly excited. There is a long way to go, but I do think this. The big scare factors, the idea that, well, if we weren't part of the European Union, they wouldn't buy our goods, I think that really is diminishing as a fear factor with British people. I think, people understand that trade takes place all over the world between countries who very rarely have political union. And I think the migrant crisis and the sheer numbers of people coming to Britain and some very big questions today about are the figures we've had since 2004 the right ones, or indeed are they much higher? I think that concern, add to that now fears about security, fears about terrorism, and I think this argument that we should be controlling our borders will, in my view, become the central part of this referendum campaign. So
it's your view then that immigration, the migrant crisis, that will become the dominant theme of the in-out referendum?
Yes, because the question is, I think, in the end, the question is this. Is Britain safer and more secure being part of the European Union or taking back control of our own lives? And I think increasingly there is an argument that actually controlling your borders, being as far away from a common European asylum policy that frankly is inviting terrorism to come into Europe, is the right and sensible place to be.
Of course, many people on the other side will say the exact opposite, that at a time of terrorism and insecurity and danger, we need to be inside the European Union. We need to work with our European allies to combat terrorism, as we did with the French after the attacks on Paris, and as we're doing with the Germans too, that the argument of security will be used as a reason for staying inside the EU.
Well, of course we want to work with our European neighbours to deal with cross-border crime, whether it's the drugs trade or people trafficking or indeed terrorism. And, you know, we can do that as sovereign governments. We can do that through Interpol. The point I'm making is that of the 1.5 million people who have come and settled in Europe this year as part of the EU's common asylum policy, barely a single one of them has been security checked. And increasingly, we are seeing the Greek islands that are being used by jihadists as a means of getting into Europe. Of that, there is no doubt. And once they've got German passports or French passports in 3 or 4 years' time, they can all come to Britain. And that, I think, becomes a really important fundamental argument.
All right. A lot of issues there which we will have plenty of time to talk in 2016. Yeah. Let me ask you an issue of process just for the moment. And that is if the deal is done, if some kind of deal is done in February at the next summit, it raises the possibility of the opportunity of having the referendum in June, though there could well be a number of hurdles in the way of doing that, and if not June, September. Let me ask you 2 questions. Do you think it will now be in 2016, and if so, what's your best guess as to when in 2016?
It'll be the 3rd Thursday in June. I'm absolutely certain now that it'll be in June.
Really?
I'm a gambling man.
I was hoping to go to France that day for a holiday.
Well, bad luck, Andrew, you know. But no, I think it will be. I mean, look, from the Prime Minister's perspective, the possibility of 16 and 17-year-olds getting the vote, which could have delayed the whole process by 6 months, that's out of the way. Secondly, I think the Prime Minister will look at next summer when maybe even more migrants will come into Europe, across the Mediterranean and through the Western Balkans. And thirdly, he will calculate that the outside is divided. He will see that there is Vote Leave, there is Leave.eu, the attempt at peace negotiations have failed, and hey presto, on the very morning when the Prime Minister looks at his most vulnerable on this renegotiation, a senior figure within UKIP tries to cause a rumpus there. And I think for all those reasons, he'll go early, not late. All
right, very interesting. 3rd Thursday in June.
Put it in the diary.
Get that in my diary, everybody? That's that trip to France. Got kiboshed. Nigel Farage, stay with us one more time, please. We're still sticking with you, Joe.
We are. After UKIP dramatically won the European elections last year, Mr Farage warned the political establishment to expect an upset at May's general election. But it turned out that the self-styled People's Army didn't have quite as much firepower as he had hoped, winning only 1 seat. Since then, the party has been fraught with division and infighting. And in the latest volley, the party's only MP, Douglas Carswell, told the BBC that UKIP needs a fresh face as leader, with an optimistic message for the future. Here's a look at UKIP's year.
Been brought up around fish, but it weren't the thing. It weren't for me. I didn't like smelling like fish.
Oh, I'd be one of those flavours that some people absolutely adore and others find a bit tricky. You come into Britain from anywhere in the world and get diagnosed with HIV and get the retroviral drugs.
18,838.
I don't break my word, so I should be writing to the UK UKIP National Executive in a few minutes saying that I am standing down. What's the code for this building now? Every single one of our major donors came out publicly in support of me yesterday. I mean, I've never had support like it.
I think Nigel is a very divisive character in terms of the way he is perceived.
I've never heard so much twaddle all my life. Typical Mr Tatchell. Well, I'm gay. I mean, you can't get more gay than me, and I'm the leader of UKIP Scotland.
UKIP, 6,487.
and I do hereby declare that Jim McMahon is duly elected as the Member of Parliament.
Have you ever lied in an interview?
Oh, yeah. Only on this programme.
Only on Well, Nigel Farage, all the good and the bad bits there. It's been an eventful year. Has it been good or bad overall from your perspective?
Well, isn't it funny? In 2014, we got 4.5 million votes. We won the European elections, and that was amazing. In this year's general election, we still got 4 million votes. I mean, despite first past the post, and that was deemed to be a failure. Here we are now, 7 months on from the election. Our support is 25% higher than it was in the general election, and I have never, in over 20 years of UKIP, seen a party that is more solidly united around policy, direction and leadership than it is today. And what we've had, ever since that general election, is one individual, mostly in private, but today in public, criticising the leadership.
Right.
Well, that's fine.
Right.
That's
hang
fine.
on.
That's fine.
Well,
But
since you mentioned him, and it is the season of goodwill, but Douglas Carswell perhaps didn't get the message from your office. He hasn't held back. Let's hear him.
Sometimes a startup needs to change gear and to change its management if it's to go the next level. And you know, the Oldham by-election to me said very clearly that I think we need a fresh face.
That doesn't sound much like unity, Nigel Farage, from the one UKIP MP.
Well, as I say to you, I have the unanimous support of the UKIP National Executive, the unanimous support of UKIP's MEPs, and amazingly, 91.4% of UKIP voters in a recent opinion poll support my leadership.
Right.
So my position has never been secure. There is more secure. There's one person who doesn't agree with all of this.
But he's quite an important person, isn't he? Because he managed to get elected.
Well, he did, but, you know, so what? He's
Really?
one person. Yet so what? We cannot have one individual. Every single time there's a UKIP conference, it finishes with a story of disunity, and it's all being caused by one person. And frankly, I think it's going to have to end.
How's it going to have to end?
Well, it's going to have to end. He's going to have to put up or shut up. Either he accepts that UKIP is unified, not just behind its leadership, but behind believing that controlling our borders and dealing with immigration is a fundamental issue in British politics and not something we should shy away from. You know, either he's going to have to accept that or do something different.
Well, and do something different will leave the party.
I don't know what he wants to do. I mean, in the end, you know, it will not be me that makes these decisions. It'll be Douglas that makes these decisions. Now, we know that he agrees with us on the question of European Union membership. The difficulty is, we think controlling immigration, having an Australian-style, you know, point system is the right way forward.
Yeah.
He seems to feel it's a bit too awkward to talk about these things.
Do you regret him joining UKIP?
No, of course not. I mean, that was, you know, a big part of building our momentum, winning that by-election, winning Rochester. You know, all of that was part of our journey. And actually, the People's Army is growing with every month, you know, that goes by. And he's been a part of that. But he must decide whether he wants to continue to be a part of it.
Right, because otherwise, in your mind, he should leave.
Well, we cannot have, and I don't think our national executive will allow one individual to give an impression to the country that UKIP's divided when actually it's very united.
Have you spoken to him? When did you last speak to him?
About a week ago, 10 days ago, around about the Syria vote, I guess.
Right, and how was that?
Well, you know, he wanted to vote for the intervention in Syria. We as a party traditionally have been very non-interventionist in things like this. I could live with that. But, you know, his criticisms over the Oldham by-election, frankly, are pretty invalid. You know, if 2.5 years ago we got a corner of the vote in a northern by-election, people would have said that was phenomenal. And it wasn't demographically a very easy seat for us.
All right. Nigel Farage, thank you. Danny Finkelstein?
You got to have
What say you?
You've got a heart of stone not to laugh to have a parliamentary party of one and end up with a split in it. Actually, funnily enough, I'm on Nigel Farage's side in this. There is a base for UKIP, and it is people who share Nigel Farage's view, basically, on immigration. I don't belong to that base. He does, and Douglas Carswell doesn't. Douglas Carswell is a libertarian who believes in reducing, halving the expenditure on the health service, privatising on education, privatising the National Health Service. He set all this out in his book, The End of Politics, and he thinks that the country should have a liberal immigration policy. He doesn't fit with UKIP, and the limits on UKIP are not set by Nigel Farage. They're set by the fact that UKIP takes a strong opinion which is acceptable to a group of people and will never go beyond it. So intrinsically, in my view, the UKIP project is limited. It will never be successful beyond it.
I mean, Danny is right. The interviews we've done with Douglas Carswell, there has been a bit of a sort of divergence, if you like, on key issues between Douglas Carswell and the rest of the party. But in terms of this claim of unity, it hasn't just been about Douglas Carswell. There has been infighting with Suzanne Evans and Patrick O'Flynn. How do you see UKIP progressing in 2016?
As a fight for Nigel Farage to get his enemies out of the party. I think Danny's exactly right. Unfortunately, it is quite funny. It's a mirror of what's happening in the Labour Party, except on a tiny scale that could be resolved with an arm wrestle, basically, and one of them would get to be in charge and the other one would. But that's a huge problem. There has been a persistent question about what is UKIP beyond Nigel Farage. On the day after the election, Nick Clegg stood down, Ed Miliband stood down. There was no question.
Well, so did Nigel Farage, of course, but he changed his mind.
Exactly. There was no question that their parties would somehow manage without them. But the unresignation came back from Nigel Farage within 48 hours, and that's been the persistent question.
Is it not possible? I don't know how that it's peaked.
Well, it's possible. I think actually the big difficulty will be less what happens to UKIP, but what happens to the EU referendum campaign. I think Nigel Farage is right. The way to fight membership of the European Union is on immigration. And Douglas Carswell and a number of other people don't want to do it on that basis. Okay. And I think after the European referendum, they'll have a very serious problem after that. And during
remember, it's the third week of June.
Well, Mr. Carswell is UKIP, but it sounds like Mr. Farage wants him to drop the UK and the P bit and just be an independent MP on his own. I thank Steve Battle-Much. He's a Labour councillor in Nottingham, saying it can't be the third Thursday in June for the referendum because England play Wales that day in the Euro 16. I'm not sure what that means. I mean, if it was something important like England playing Australia at Lords, I would understand.
No, but Danny Finkelstein,
anyway,
that would be important for you.
That would be important, right? There you go. Thank you, Steve from Notts.